Hello and welcome. My name is Alan, and today we are starting a new series. Yeah, we are reading the Mythology, Timeless Tales of Gods and Heroes. This is about the Greek pantheon and heroes and everything. I've already read this personally before. It's a good book, it's a good read. We got through reading the Prose Edda, which is like the most defining source of Norse mythology. This is a good starter if you enjoy Greek mythology. Written by Edith Hamilton. But yeah. Uh, do, 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 do. We'll not worry about the forward. Contents. Illustrated. There is illustrations in the book, such as at the very beginning here. But let's start this off. Introduction to Classical Mythology. Of old and Hellenic race. Of old, the Hellenic race was marked off from the barbarian at more keen witted and more free from nonsense. And that's a piece from Herodotus 1, part 60. Greek and Roman mythology is quite generally supposed to show us the way the human race thought and felt untold ages ago, though through it, according to this view, we can retrace the path of civilized man who lives so far from nature to man who lived in close companionship with nature. And the real interest of the myths is that they lead us back to a time when the world was young and the people had a connection with the earth, with trees and seas and flowers and hills, unlike anything we ourselves can feel. When the stories were being shaped, we are given to understand little distinction had as yet been made between the real and the unreal. The imagination was vividly alive and not checked by the reason, so that anyone in the woods might see through the trees a fleeing nymph, or bending over a clear pool to drink, behold the depths a naiad's face. The prospect of traveling back to a delightful state of things as held out by nearly every writer who touches upon classic mythology above all of the poets in that indefinitely remote time primitive man could have sight of Proteus rising from the sea, or hear old Triton blow his wreathed horn. And we for a moment can catch through the mists he made a glimpse of that strangely and beautifully um, animated world. But a very brief consideration of the ways of ancient or of uncivilized peoples everywhere and in the ages is enough to prick the romantic uh, that romantic bubble. Nothing is clearer than the fact that primitive man, whether in New Guinea today um, or eons ago in the prehistoric wilderness, is not and never has been a creature who peoples this world with bright fancies and lovely visions. Horrors lurked in the primeval forest, not nymphs and naiads. Terror lived there, and with its close attendant, magic, and its most common defense, human sacrifice. Mankind's chief hope of escaping the wrath of whatever divinities were then abroad lay in some magical rite, senseless but powerful, or in some suffering made at the cost of pain and grief. The mythology of the Greeks. The dark picture of is worlds apart from the stories of classical mythology. The study of the way early man looked at his surroundings does not get much help from the Greeks. How briefly the anthropologists treat the Greek myths is noteworthy. Of course, the Greeks too had their roots in the primeval slime. Of course, they too once lived a savage life, ugly and brutal. But what the myths show is how high they had risen above the ancient filth and fierceness of time we have any knowledge of them. Only a few traces of that time are to be found in the stories. We do not know when these stories were first told in their present shape, but whenever it was, primitive life had been left far behind. The myths as we have them are the creation of great poets. The first written record of Greece is the Iliad. Greek mythology begins with Homer, generally believed to be not earlier than 1,000 years before Christ. The Iliad is or contains the oldest Greek literature and is written in rich and subtle and beautiful language, which must have been behind it centuries when men were striving to express themselves with clarity and beauty, an indisputable proof of civilization. The tales of Greek mythology do not throw any clear light upon the what early mankind was like. They do throw an abundance of light upon what early Greeks were like, a matter it would seem of more importance to us who are their descendants intellectually, artistically, and politically too. Nothing we learn about them is alien to ourselves. People often speak of the Greek miracle, what the phrase tries to express in the new birth of the world with the awakening of Greece. Old things are passed away, behold, all things are become new. Something like that happened in Greece. Why it happened or when, we have no idea at all. We know only that in the earliest Greek poets, a new point of view dawned, never dreamed of in the world before them, but never to leave the world after them. With the coming forward of Greece, mankind became the center of the universe, and most important thing in it, this was a revolution in thought. Human beings had counted for little heretofore. In Greece, man first realized what mankind was. The Greeks made their gods in their own image. That had not entered the mind of man before. Until then, gods had no semblance of reality. They were unlike all living things. In Egypt, a towering colossus, immobile beyond the power of the imagination to endow with movement, is fixed in the stone as the tremendous temple columns, a representation of the human shape deliberately made inhuman. Or a rigid figure, a woman with a cat's head suggesting inflexible, inhuman cruelty, or a monstrous, mysterious sphinx aloof from all that lives. In Mesopotamia, bas reliefs of bestial shapes, unlike the any beasts ever known. Men with birds' heads and lions with bulls' heads, and both with eagles' wings. Creations of artists who were intent upon producing something never seen except in their own minds. The very consummation of unreality. These and their like were what the pre-Greek world worshipped. One need only place beside them in imagination any Greek statue of a god, so normal and natural with all its beauty, to perceive what a new idea had come into the world with its coming, and the universe became rational. St. Paul and the invisible said the invisible must be understood by the visible. This was not a Hebrew idea, it was Greek. In Greece alone, in the ancient world, people were preoccupied with the visible. They were finding the satisfaction of their desires in what was actually in the world around them. The sculptor watched the athletes contending in the games, and he felt that nothing he could imagine would be as beautiful as those strong young bodies. So he made the statue of Apollo. The storyteller found Hermes among the people he passed on the street. He saw the god like a young man at the age when youth is loveliest, as Homer says. Greek artists and poets realized how splendid a man could be, straight and swift and strong. He was the fulfillment of their search for beauty. They had no wish to create some fantasy shaped in their own minds. All the art and all the thought of Greece centered in human beings. Human gods naturally made heaven a pleasantly familiar place. The Greeks felt at home in it. They knew just what the divine inhabitants did there, and they ate and drank, and where they banqueted, and how they amused themselves. Of course, they were to be feared. They were very powerful and very dangerous when angry. Still, with proper care, a man could be quite fairly at ease with them. He was even perfectly free to laugh at them. Zeus, trying to hide his love affairs from his wife, and invariably uh, shown up, was a capital figure of fun. The Greeks enjoyed him and liked him all the better for it. Hera was that stock character of comedy, the typical jealous wife, and her ingenious tricks to discomfort her husband and punish her rival, far from displeasing the Greeks, entertained from as much as Hera's modern counterpart does as today. Such stories made for a friendly feeling. Laughter in the presence of the Egyptian Sphinx or an Assyrian bird beast was inconceivable, but it was perfectly natural in Olympus, and it made the gods companionable. On earth, too, the deities were exceedingly so humanly attractive in the form of lovely youths and maidens. They peopled in the woodland, the forest, the rivers, the sea, in harmony with fair earth and the bright waters. What is the miracle of Greek mythology? A humanized world, men freed from the paralyzing fear of an omnipotent unknown, the terrifying incomprehensibilities which were worshipped elsewhere, and the fearsome spirits with which earth, air, and sea swarmed were banned from Greece. It may seem odd to say that the men who made the myths disliked the irrational and had a love for facts, but it is true. No matter how wildly fantastic some of the stories are, anyone who reads them with attention discovers that even the most nonsensical take place in a world which is essentially rational and matter of fact. Hercules, whose life was one long combat against preposterous monsters, is always said to have had his home in the city of Thebes, the exact spot where Aphrodite was born. Of the foam could be visited by any ancient tourist. It was just offshore from the island of Cythera. The winged steed Pegasus, after skimming the air all day, went every night to a comfortable stable in Corinth. A familiar local habitation gave reality to all the mythical beings. If the mixture seems childish, consider how reassuring and how sensible the solid background is as compared with the genie who comes from nowhere when Aladdin rubs the lamp and, his task accomplished, returns to nowhere. The terrifying irrational has no place in classical mythology. Magic so powerful in the world before and after Greece, is almost non existent. There are no men, and only two women with dreadful supernatural powerful powers. The demoniac, demoniac wizards and the hideous old witches who haunted Europe and America too up to quite recent years play a part in all the stories. Circe and Medea are the only witches, and they are young and of surpassing beauty, delightful, not horrible. Astrology, which has flourished in the days of ancient Babylon down to today, is completely absent from classical Greece. There are many stories about the stars, but not a trace of the idea of the influence men's lives. Astronomy is what the Greek mind finally made out of the stars. Not a single story has a magical priest who is terribly to be feared because he knows ways of winning over the gods or alienating them. The priest is rarely seen and is never of importance. In the Odyssey, when a priest and a poet fall on their knees before Odysseus, praying him to spare their lives, the hero kills the priest without a thought, but saves the poet. Homer says that he felt awe to slay a man who had been taught his divine art by the gods. Not the priest, but the poet had influence with heaven, and no one was ever afraid of a poet. Ghosts, too, which have played so large and so fearsome a part in other lands, never appear on earth in any Greek story. The Greeks were not afraid of the dead. The piteous dead, the Odyssey calls them. The world of Greek mythology was not a place of terror for the human spirit. It is true that the gods were disconcertingly incalculable. One could never tell where Zeus's thunderbolt would strike. Nevertheless, the whole divine company, with a very few and for the most part not important exceptions, were entrancingly beautiful with a human beauty, and nothing humanly beautiful is really terrifying. The early Greek mythologies transformed a world full of fear into a world full of beauty. This bright picture has its dark spots. The change came about slowly and was never quite completed. The gods became human, were for a long time a very slight improvement upon their worshippers. They were incomparably lovelier and more powerful, and they were of course immortal, but they often acted in a way no decent man or woman would. In the Iliad, Hector is nobler by far than any of the heavenly beings, and Andromache infinitely to be preferred to Athena or Aphrodite. Hera, from first to last, is a goddess on a very low level of humanity. Almost every one of the radiant divinities could act cruelly or be contemptibly or contemptibly. A very limited sense of right and wrong prevailed in Homer's heaven, and not a long time after. And for a long time after. Other dark spots too stand out. There are traces of a time when there were beast gods. The satyrs are goatmen, and the centaurs are half man, half horse. Hera is often called cow faced, as if the adjective had somehow stuck to her through all her changes from a divine cow to a very human queen of heaven. There are also stories which point back clearly to a time when there was human sacrifice. But what is astonishing is not that bits of savage belief were left here and there. The strange thing is that they are so few. Of course, the mythical monster is present in any number of shapes. Gorgons and hydras and chimeras dire. But they were only to give the hero his meed of glory. What could a hero do in a world without them? They are always overcome by him. The great hero of mythology, Hercules, might be an allegory of Greece herself. He fought the monsters and freed the earth from them, just as Greece freed the earth from the monstrous idea of an inhuman supreme over the human. Greek mythology is largely made up of stories about gods and goddesses, but it must not be read as a kind of Greek Bible, an account of Greek religion. According to the most modern idea, real myth has nothing to do with religion. It is an explanation of something in nature, how, for instance, any and everything in the universe came into existence. Men, animals, this and that tree or flower, the sun, the moon, the stars, storms, eruptions, earthquakes, all that is and all that happens. Thunder and lightning are caused when Zeus hurls his thunderbolt. A volcano erupts because a terrible terrible creature is imprisoned in the mountain, and every now and then struggles to get free. The Dipper, the constellation called also the Great Bear, does not set below the horizon because a goddess once was angry at it and decreed that it should never sink into the sea. Myths are early science, the result of men's first trying to explain what they saw around them. But there are many so-called myths which explain nothing at all. The tales are pure entertainment, and the sort of thing people would tell each other on a long winter's evening. The story of Pygmalion and Galatea is an example. It has no conceivable connection with any event in nature. Neither has the quest for the Golden Fleece, nor Orpheus and Eurydice, nor many another. This fact is now generally accepted, and we do not have to find in every mythological heroine the moon or the dawn, and in every hero's life a sun myth. The stories are early literature as well as early science. But religion is there too. In the background, to be sure, but nevertheless plain to see. From Homer through the tragedians and even later, there is a deepening realization of what human beings need and what they must have in their gods. Zeus the Thunderer was, it seems certain, once a rain god. He was supreme even over the rain, or over the sun, because rocky Greece needed rain more than sunshine, and the god of gods would be the one who could give the precious water of life to his worshippers. But Homer's Zeus is not a fact of nature. He is a person living in a world where civilization has made an entry, and of course he has a standard of right and wrong. It is not very high, certainly, and seems chiefly applicable to others, not to himself. But he does punish men who lie and break their oaths. He is angered by any ill treatment of the dead, and he pities and helps old Priam when he goes as a suppliant to Achilles. In the Odyssey, he has reached a higher level. The swineherd there says that the needy and the stranger are from Zeus, and he who fails to help them sins against Zeus himself. Hesiod, not much later than the Odyssey, if at all, says a man who does evil to the suppliant and the stranger, or who wrongs orphan children, with that man Zeus is angry. Then justice became Zeus's companion. That was a new idea. The buccaneering chieftains in the Iliad did not want justice. They wanted to be able to take whatever they chose because they were strong, and they wanted a god who was on the side of the strong. But Hesiod, who was a peasant living in a poor man's world, knew that the poor must have a just god. He wrote, "Fishes and beasts and fowls of the air devour one another. But to man Zeus has given justice. Beside Zeus is his throne, justice has her seat." These passages show that the great and bitter needs of the helpless were reaching up to the heaven and changing the God of the strong into the protector of the weak. So back of the stories of an amorous Zeus and a cowardly Zeus and a ridiculous Zeus, we can catch sight of another Zeus coming into being, as men grow continually more conscious of what life demanded of them and what human beings needed in the god they worshipped. Gradually, this Zeus displaced the others until he occupied the whole scene. At last, he became, in the words of Dio Chrysostom, who wrote during the 2nd century A.D., "Our Zeus is the giver of every good gift, the common father and the savior and guardian of mankind." The Odyssey speaks of the divine for which all men long, and the hundreds of years later, Aristotle wrote, "Excellence much labored for the race of mortals, The Greeks from the earliest mythologists had a perception of the divine and the excellent. Their longing for them was great enough to make them never give up laboring to see them clearly until at last the thunder and lightning were changed into a universal father. The Greek and Roman writers of mythology. Most of the books about the stories of classical mythology depend chiefly upon the Latin poet Ovid, who wrote during the reign of Augustus. Ovid is a compendium of mythology. No ancient writer can compare with him in this respect. He told almost all the stories, and he told them in great length. Occasionally, stories familiar to us through literature and art have come down to us only in his pages. In this book, I have avoided using him as far as possible. Undoubtedly, he was a good poet and a good storyteller and able to appreciate the myths enough to realize what excellent material they offered him. But he was really further away from them in his point of view than we are today. They were sheer nonsense to him. He wrote, I prate of ancient poets, monstrous lies, ne'er seen or now or then by human eyes. He says in effect to the reader, never mind how silly they are, I will dress them up so prettily for you that you will like them. And he does, often very prettily indeed, but in his hands the stories which are factual truth and solemn truth to the early Greek poets Hesiod and Pindar, and vehicles of deep religious truth to the Greek tragedians, becomes idle tales, sometimes witty and diverting, often sentimental and distressingly rhetorical. The Greek mythologists are not rhetoricians and are notably free from sentimentality. The list of the chief writers through whom the myths have come down to us is not long. Homer heads it, of course. The Iliad and the Odyssey are, or rather contain, the oldest Greek writings we have. There is no way to date accurately any part of them. Scholars differ widely and will no doubt continue to do so. As unobjectionable a date as any is 1000 BC. At any rate, for the Iliad, the older of the two poems. In all that follows, here and in the rest of the book, the date given is to be understood to be before Christ, unless it is otherwise dated. The second writer on the list is sometimes placed in the 9th century, sometimes in the 8th. Hesiod was a poor farmer whose life was hard and bitter. There cannot be a greater contrast than that between his poem and Works and Days, which tries to show men how to live a good life in a harsh world, and the courtly splendor of the Iliad and the Odyssey. But Hesiod has much to say about the gods, and A second poem, usually ascribed to him, the Theogony, is entirely concerned with mythology. If Hesiod did write it, then a humble peasant living on a lonely farm far from the cities was the first man in Greece to wonder how everything had happened: the world, the sky, the gods, mankind, and to think out an explanation. Homer never wondered about anything. The Theogony is an account of the creation of the universe and the generations of the gods, and it is a very important for mythology. Next in order come the Homeric hymns, poems written to honor various gods. They cannot be definitively dated, but the earliest are considered by most scholars to belong to the end of the 8th century or beginning of the 7th. The last one of importance, there are 35 in all, belongs to the 5th century or possibly 4th century Athens. Pindar, the greatest lyric poet of Greece, began to write toward the end of the 6th century. He wrote odes in honor to the victors in the games at the great national festival of Greece, and in every one of his poems myths are told or alluded to. Pindar is quite as important for mythology as Hesiod. Aeschylus, the oldest of the three tragic poets, was a contemporary of Pindar's. The other two, Sophocles and Euripides, were a little younger. Euripides, the youngest, died at the end of the 5th century, except for Aeschylus's Persians, written to celebrate the victory of the Greeks over the Persians at Salamis. All the plays have mythological subjects. With Homer, they are the most important source of our knowledge of the myths. The great writer of comedy, Aristophanes, who lived in the last part of the 5th century and the beginning of the 4th, refers to the myths, as do also two great prose writers, Herodotus, the first historian of Europe, who was a contemporary of Euripides, and Plato, the philosopher, who lived less than a generation later. The Alexandrian poets lived around 250 BC. They were so called because when they wrote, the center of Greek literature had moved from Greece to Alexandria in Egypt. Apollonius of Rhodes told at length the quest of the Golden Fleece, and in connection with the story a number of other myths. He and three other Alexandrians who also wrote about mythology, the pastoral poets Theocritus, Bion, Moschus, have lost the simplicity of Hesiod's and Pindar's beliefs in the gods, and are far removed from the depth and gravity of the tragic poet's views of religion. But they are not frivolous like Ovid. Two late writers, Apuleius, a Latin, and Lucian, a Greek, both of the 2nd century AD, make an important contribution. The famous story of Cupid and Psyche is told only by Apuleius, who writes very much like Ovid. Lucian writes like no one except himself. He satirized the gods. In his time, they had become a joking matter. Nevertheless, he gives by the way of a good deal of information about them. Apollodorus, also a Greek, is, next to Ovid, the most voluminous ancient writer in mythology, but unlike Ovid, he is very matter of fact and very dull. His date has been differently set all the way from the 1st century BC to the 9th century AD. The English scholar Sir J.G. Fraser thinks he probably wrote in either the 1st or 2nd century of our era. The Greek Pausanias, an ardent traveler, the author of the first guidebook ever written, has a good deal to say about the mythological events reported to have happened in the places he visited. He lived as late as the 2nd century AD, but he does not question any of the stories. He writes about them with complete seriousness. Of the Roman writers, Virgil stands far ahead. He did not believe the myths any more than Ovid did, whose contemporary he was, but he found human nature in them, and he brought mythological personalities or personages to life as no one had done since the Greek tragedians. Other Roman poets wrote of the myths. Catullus tells several of the stories, and Horace alludes to them often, but neither is important for mythology. To all Romans, the stories were infinitely remote, mere shadows. The best guides to a knowledge of Greek mythology are the Greek writers who believed in what they wrote. But we'll go ahead and end that piece there. It's been a long video, but that gets us through the introduction, which talks a lot about where much of our knowledge of Greek poetry comes. So yeah, Homer is a huge piece. Pindar, Hesiod. These writers are immensely important for Greek mythology. I actually have a copy of Homer's The Iliad and Odyssey. I'll get to that eventually. But yeah, it's a good sized book. But yeah, we get much of our information of mythology from those writings. So it's interesting where it all delves from. But with the next episode, we'll be getting into the beginnings of Greek mythology. We'll talk about the Titans, the birth of the gods, the gods' Greeks and Roman names, a bit about how they came to be. Um, doo, doo, doo. Artemis, Diana, Aphrodite, Venus. It like I said, it lists a lot of the major gods and goddesses: Hermes, Mercury, Ares, Mars. Like I said, it talks about their Greek and Roman names here: Hestia, Vesta. The lesser gods of Olympus, the gods of the waters. So yeah, we'll even be getting into gods who you normally don't think of, but are included in Greek mythology. Um, you often think of Neptune as god of the seas, but there was a god of lakes and rivers. God, I cannot remember his name. But he had many children, many who were naiads and nymphs. But you'll see many of these gods take effect, have effects on the Greek world. But like I said, next episode, we get into the discussion of the beginning. And we'll get to see the elemental beings, then the Titans. Yeah, you have a lot of elemental gods, elemental beings, Gaia and Oros, the sky, and the earth. You have Nyx, who is the representation of night. So, yeah. But we'll go ahead and end this episode here. As always, educate thyself. Think, read, study, learn. Someone tries to tell you something you have trouble believing, ask them to cite their sources. Thank you all for watching. I'll see you all in the next episode. Until then, later.